Welcome to the Snowbirds Expat Radio Podcast, powered by the Snowbird US Day Tracker app. I'm your host, Gerry Scott, and my goal is to give you answers to your cross-border questions, to ease the stress of a cross-border move or extended trip, and to keep you up to date on all you need to know with cross-border rules and regulations. Now let's get on with the show. Well, welcome back, everybody. We've got a great podcast on today, and this is kind of the second segment because now that I have my book that Andrew sent out about 2 weeks ago, I've had a chance to go through it, and now I have anxiety like most people when it comes to what happens if something happens to me when I'm in the United States. I get into a car accident, and I started reading through this, and I thought, I got to get my friend Andrew back on the podcast. So Andrew, welcome back. Tell us once again a little bit about your firm and what you do. And then I've got some great questions for you. You can't see them, but I've made a million notes on your book. So tell us again about yourself and your firm and what you specialize in.
Okay, thank you, Gerry. It's my pleasure to be back. It was very enjoyable talking to you the first time. And in fact, some of your listeners have reached out and asked for the book, and we really appreciate that, the opportunity to share this information. For those that may not recall from our first meeting, I'm a personal injury lawyer. Primarily, we do disability claims as well, but primarily injury, car accidents, and in particular, helping Canadians that have been injured in the United States. I practice both in Canada and the United States. We have an office in Palm Beach County, Florida. Since the last time you and I talked, we've actually opened or are launching an office. We've opened it, just getting started with an office in Texas. We have other lawyers here that are licensed in different provinces in Canada. I'm licensed in Ontario. We have a lawyer in British Columbia. We have a new lawyer that's joined us, licensed in the province of Alberta. So it really gives us an opportunity to help Canadians no matter where they are, if they've been injured in the U.S.
Now, before I make the offer that, once again, anybody who's listening to this podcast, you'll give them all the details. Are there any books left, or has this been as big a seller as I'm going to assume it has been?
It's been great. It's been fantastic. We still have books. We're happy to give them out because the whole purpose of this is really to help educate Canadians. That's the biggest reason for this. And I think it's becoming even more important as jurisdictions in Canada switch over to no fault, like a pure no fault system, which I can explore with you if you like. Because those Canadians oftentimes think that their remedy in the US is limited to the lawsuit in the U.S. potentially against an at-fault driver and no-fault benefits. But even in those no-fault jurisdictions, there is what's probably the most important coverage for Canadians traveling outside of Canada is underinsured or uninsured motorist coverage.
Well, I got to tell you, this morning I'm dealing with house insurance and I'm having a bit of a meltdown, and my poor wife gets to experience this guy having a meltdown at least once a week. But I'm dealing with my house insurance, making sure that we have the policy on hand. And now we've got one vehicle in Maui, we've got two vehicles in Canada. And just going through all this insurance, I am excited. Based on the last podcast, I had to listen to it myself, listen to the podcast a few times, and not to hear myself talk, but to really listen to what Andrew has to say. So here we are. I'm going to jump right into the question because I know you're busy and you're trying to help somebody who probably just had an accident this morning down in Florida. So my first question to you is, how common are cross-border personal injury cases in the U.S.?
So unfortunately, car crashes are still, car crashes can happen any day, every day, all over the world. I think actually car crashes are more prevalent in places where people are tourists. So in Florida, for instance, place where I travel to during season, it's very obvious that there are a lot of driving styles. There are people that simply aren't as familiar with where they're going. So they're bringing their own sort of customs and driving styles, which intersect in these more touristy locations, I would say. And also, people don't know where they're going. And so we've seen crashes where people were literally in the far left lane, assuming that they had to turn left at the next intersection, realize at the last minute, in fact, they have to go right, cut across 3 lanes, and cause catastrophic injuries. So they're very prevalent in the U.S. Lots of Canadians drive through the U.S., maybe not places like Maui, obviously, where you have to take a flight, but still a lot of Canadians, a lot of snowbirds travel. They take the I-95, they take I-75, different highways, of course, on the west. But so accidents can occur, pretty much anywhere from your home to your destination. And it's a lot of driving through the U.S. And probably Canadians drive more through the U.S. in terms of distance, kilometers traveled in a given trip than they do in Canada. Most Canadians. I don't know if there's a stat on that, but that's just in speaking with friends and relatives. I think Canadians tend to travel by car further through the U.S.
And the biggest thing that you mentioned, you've given me another, rather than calling somebody an idiot when they're driving beside me, I'm going to now say everybody has different driving styles. So thank you for that. So, and my next question was really related to Ontario, but now that I hear that you have a great contact out here in British Columbia, and we can talk about that later, what are the first steps that a Canadian needs to take when they're injured in the United States?
Okay. Yeah, that's a important question. So let's talk about a car accident. Canadians traveling, they're in a jurisdiction they're not as familiar with. So it might be Florida, it might be Texas, might be somewhere else. Obviously very similar to Canada. You want to make sure there's a police report. Okay, so if you're able to, you make sure the police are called to the scene of the accident. That's particularly important in a jurisdiction you're not from, because the police will, at a very minimum, collect the essential information that you will need later if you want to advance a claim, whether it's an insurance claim or a claim against the at-fault party. Names, witnesses, locations. Oftentimes, Canadians, particularly those either on their way to their snowbird destination or on their way back to Canada, don't even recall where they were when the crash occurred. They might have been in a state they were just passing through. So very important, get a police report to memorialize those details. Secondly, or maybe it's first, seek medical treatment. With few exceptions, Canadians that have an injury in the U.S. should absolutely seek medical treatment to make sure there's, no life-threatening or emergency health issue. Despite fear, oftentimes Canadians have fear of American medical bills. In our experience, those fears are usually, I'm not going to say they're justified, clearly, but your health is more important. I'll say it like that.
Now, how often, and these questions that I'm asking Andrew are right out of the book. These are the chapters, but it gets me thinking: is that how often do you see that these Canadians that are injured in the United States have opted not to get travel insurance?
I think now travel insurance is more common. Certainly snowbirds that are staying in the U.S. for an extended period of time. I think it's very rare that we meet a snowbird involved in a crash that does not have travel insurance. People traveling for shorter visits, it's less common, although I think it's becoming more common as Canadians become educated about, sort of the risks of accidents while traveling abroad. So just in my own observation and experience, it's becoming more common, travel insurance.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what evidence is critical to building a personal injury case?
I hope I'm consistent with the book. I haven't actually looked at the book in a while. So I probably
That's
should
okay.
have.
Let me know if you need a hand. I can go right
But
into it and start reading it out like this is story time, okay?
no, that's great. But you're asking, the question is, what evidence is important in a personal injury case?
Yes.
Okay. So in a car accident claim in the US, there are always two broad parts to that case to ultimately succeed. Okay. And then we can go further if you like, but very sort of high level. Every case requires the injured party to establish liability or fault against another party if you're going to claim against that party or their insurance company. And then secondly is damages, which is a legal term for the money that you receive. Okay, so another way of thinking of damages is the harms and the losses resulting from the crash. So the evidence will touch upon both subjects. So let's talk first about fault. The obvious evidence is evidence related to the crash, the vehicles involved, the property damage, the witnesses, information gathered by police, any sort of investigations can be evidence used to help establish fault. There are situations where it occurs at a traffic light and the parties are disputing whether the light was green in their direction or red or yellow. And those are situations where the evidence becomes very important. Witnesses, the measurements, location of the vehicles following the crash, where they came to rest. So those are the types of things. Canadian can try to preserve evidence by obtaining the names and contact information of witnesses, obviously involved parties, their insurance information, license plate numbers, photographs or video at the scene of the crash, of the road, the orientation of the vehicles, and also the license plate numbers, which will help us track down the ownership.
Okay. So if I accept a settlement offer, how long will it take before I receive any kind of compensation?
Okay, so if I'm gonna step back just a moment on that. So a settlement offer can come in a number of ways. So if a Canadian's seriously injured in the United States, very often American insurance companies are far more proactive and aggressive in a sense in terms of managing risk. So it's not unusual in a serious crash for the at-fault party's insurance company to mobilize very quickly, get in touch with the victim, and offer money. The money offer will be conditioned upon the injured party, so the Canadian, signing a release. It's very important. Number one, if an insurance company ever reaches out to you following a crash in the US, not to sign the release, don't accept the money until you've consulted with a lawyer, attorney, experience that can give you some guidance on what you may be giving up. This is especially true for Canadians. Especially true for Canadians because the release is what they're buying. The release is the contract that extinguishes your rights as the injured party to advance any claims against the at-fault driver and their insurance company. But most of the time for Canadians, that's not really the ultimate outcome. The ultimate outcome for most Canadians is the claims against their own Canadian auto insurance policy for things like underinsured motorist benefits. So where a car that caused the crash doesn't have enough coverage, and no fault benefits, etc. When you sign that release, you could be giving up your right to advance that claim in Canada, which could be far greater in terms of the monetary recovery than what the insurance company in the U.S. is offering you. So that's where I would caution people, be very careful about signing that. I can tell you, British Columbia, for instance, before we got on this call, I asked my colleague Colton, who's licensed in British Columbia, hey, pull up the equivalent of British Columbia, just in case I get asked questions. Now, I'm not licensed in British Columbia. Consult with a lawyer there. Colton, you'll be happy to talk to. But just like Ontario, British Columbia has, British Columbia has explicit provision in their policy for underinsured motorist benefits, saying you must notify us and get our permission before you release the at-fault party. And the reason, in case you're wondering, the reason why insurance companies in Canada want the opportunity to find out how much are you getting from the U.S., who's paying it, and don't sign the release yet until you tell us. Here's why. Your Canadian auto insurance coverage for underinsured motorist claims, meaning claims against drivers that don't have enough insurance to cover your total losses, is designed to take the stress out of it for you, the injured party. Okay, so it allows you to claim that money against your own insurance company, but then your rights are transferred to your insurance company in terms of the ability to then sue the at-fault party and try to recover those losses against them, someone who's inadequately insured, uninsured, maybe doesn't have a lot of assets. So that's why you definitely, absolutely have to notify your Canadian insurance company, give them an opportunity to do an asset search. Almost always, in our experience, the Canadian insurance company will ultimately agree to allow you to sign that release. But then there is special language or magic language which we want to include in the release to make sure it's a limited release, that you're only releasing the at-fault party, but that as a Canadian, you are still preserving all rights and remedies against any of your own first-party insurers, your auto insurance, your medical insurance, anything else you might have, disability claims, etc.
People just to panic and sign, and they realize they got themselves in a bind, and now they get on the phone and call Andrew.
We don't really meet those people that just sign, that come to it. Well, we have, I guess we have, but most of the time, when people are offered money, thankfully, the people that we meet, most of the time when they're offered money and asked to sign the document, most do get the advice of a lawyer. If they get a lawyer that doesn't have experience in cross-border cases, maybe they sign and have left all these Canadian benefits behind without knowing. I know that for sure. Lots of Canadians don't even know that there's a whole other set of claims that are available to them in Canada. But very often we'll get calls from U.S. lawyers that have been consulted by a Canadian, and maybe the American insurance company has tendered the limits Limits could be as low as 10,000, sometimes zero, but let's call it 10,000, 20,000, 50,000. And if you have a prudent lawyer in the U.S., they know what they don't know. And I would say the majority of the calls we get throughout the United States, other than jurisdictions where we're more active in, is from lawyers in those jurisdictions wanting to make sure that they cover all their bases and don't prejudice their clients' rights to then claim against their Canadian insurance policy.
So if my case goes to litigation in the US, what should I expect as a Canadian citizen?
That's a good question. It's a great question, and it's changed since COVID. Okay, so it's changed for the better for Canadians. U.S. litigation, for the most part, is far more robust and faster by a lot than Canadian litigation. Florida, for instance, now it's a requirement passed from the Florida Supreme Court, requiring civil matters to be tried to verdict within 18 months of the lawsuit being filed. That's exceptionally fast in comparison to Canadian litigation. And those are the outside limits. So cases could get to trial even sooner. So number one, cases proceed at lightning speed. Canadians would be expected to participate in a deposition where they're giving evidence under oath. For the most part, today, that is done by Zoom, by video call. So they don't have to travel to the U.S. for that. But Canadians will be expected to travel to the United States for expert medical assessments if their case gets that far. Medical assessments from an expert witness that the parties may intend to call to testify at trial. And if a case goes to trial, the Canadian will be expected to travel back to that jurisdiction where the crash occurred to attend the trial. Most cases in the United States, just like in Canada, the vast majority settle. Probably the vast majority settle even before a lawsuit is filed. But those that go into litigation, the vast majority settle somewhere between filing suit and ultimately commencing trial, probably about 98%.
So what are some of the defenses used by insurance companies to avoid paying out to Canadian citizens?
So one thing I'll say is Canadians are they start at a disadvantage. There's no question. Okay, they start at a disadvantage when commencing a claim in the U.S. or against the U.S. insurance company. And the biggest disadvantage is the adjusters have been trained in all of their experience and knowledge is based on what I'll call the medical workup that may occur in that home jurisdiction, that jurisdiction where the crash occurred. So if the Canadian is very seriously injured and the medical workup occurs in Florida, for instance, it's one thing, but very often they're flown back to Canada. There's usually a really short period of time, even with emergency medical in the U.S. And then the typical scenario is a flight back and an admission to maybe a trauma hospital in Canada, and there'll be a medical flight back to Canada. Well, then the medical tends to move a little slower, especially on discharge. So that's the one disadvantage Canadians had if they return to Canada and the primary treatment is in Canada. Sometimes the medical records that the adjuster may expect to see are not present. Number two, medical bills could be much lower if at all. So um, that's a big disadvantage. And those are the real two, is the medical workup and the medical costs. But there are ways around that. So with the right guidance, you understand that an American adjuster is looking through that lens when assessing the case and establishing value. And so with the right guidance, there are things that can be done to help tell the story in the light most favorable to the victim.
Now, this one chapter you have here, it says compensation available to a Canadian citizen injured in an auto wreck in the U.S. So go into your book. That's more so what compensation is available through your Canadian policy if you're injured in the United States.
All right. So we'll talk about the Canadian policy. Yeah. So there are two parts depending on the jurisdiction you're in. Okay. So let's use, for instance, let's use Ontario, because that's jurisdiction I'm most familiar with in Canada. So in Ontario, so if a Canadian is injured anywhere in the United States, with respect to their Canadian auto policy, they're entitled to what's called no-fault benefits. So those are benefits irrespective of fault. So even if the Canadian or the Ontario resident traveled somewhere in the United States, got drunk, and drove their car into a tree, okay, they are still entitled to no-fault benefits under their Canadian auto policy. Many of these policies will give the policyholder, so the Canadian, the right to elect between those benefits that are available in Canada or those benefits available in the jurisdiction where the crash occurred. So it's very important at the outset, if we'll use the Ontario as an example, Ontario resident is being asked by their insurance company to choose between Florida or Ontario no-fault benefits, get advice from a lawyer that knows both. It's kind of like a menu. You want to look through facts and circumstances of your case, your injuries, and decide which coverage is best for you. Most of the time it's the Ontario benefits, but not always. Depends on where the crash occurred. The second part is the underinsured or uninsured claim. So that would arise in a situation where the at-fault driver maybe had $50,000 or $100,000 or less in liability coverage, and the claim between the losses, the injuries, the pain and suffering, etc., exceeds that. Then that can be advanced against your Canadian policy. It typically requires a lawsuit being filed, but the damages or the losses that can be recovered include pain and suffering, income loss, and healthcare costs and other care costs. So things like housekeeping, home maintenance, etc., that you require assistance with because of your injuries.
Now, do you handle, and it's kind of a two-part question, do you handle U.S. people that are driving up here in Canada and get injured? And then my second part of that question is that American, if you had to say, if you're an American getting in an accident in Canada, is it worse, or is it worse for a Canadian getting injured in a car crash in the United States?
Okay, those are great questions. And I hope I keep it all together, because you asked many. And so the first part, sorry, can you remind me what the first one was?
Yeah, the first part is, do you represent Americans that have car accidents in Canada?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. We probably, just because of the nature of our practice and our relationships with lawyers throughout the U.S., and just through word of mouth and listservs and organizations between trial lawyers, I don't know statistically, but I would think in Ontario, we probably represent more Americans injured in Canada probably than any other personal injury firm, just because of that. So that's your first question. So absolutely, we help also Americans injured in Canada. I think the second part of your question was, who's better off? Canadian injured in the US or an American injured in Canada? Well, they're different. So earlier when I was highlighting some of the disadvantages for Canadians injured in the US in terms of creating risk or exposure and being able to tell that story to an American adjuster, those disadvantages that the Canadian has, I would say the opposite effect occurs with an American injured in Canada. Okay, so what I mean by that is an American gets rear-ended in Ontario, they return to Florida or Texas, and then they have the ability to really tell that story in terms of medical workup, and it's robust. And the risk to the Canadian insurance company is U.S. medical bills. The bills mount quickly. In our experience, Canadian insurance companies tend to be afraid, more worried or concerned when they're dealing with a claim from an American because of the potential future cost of care. So if you get an expert report to identify, well, this person has some permanent injury and impairment, and they're going to need care for the rest of their life, those bills will be considerably higher than what the exposure would be if it was a Canadian. So that's an advantage to the American. Also, just the speed with which the medical workup occurs. Canadians, I'll use the herniated disc case. Okay, Canadian rear-ended whiplash herniated disc. It might take months and months to finally identify through MRI that it's in fact a herniated disc. There could be a causation defense. Well, how do we know that actually occurred from the crash? You didn't have the imaging until 7 months later. The American, if they return back to their home state quickly after their accident in Canada, they'll probably have the MRI the same week. They'll have a consultation with a spine surgeon within a couple of weeks. They'll probably start getting injections in the first month. If the injections fail, they'll be scheduled for, depending on the severity of the injury, they may even have spine surgery within 3 or 4 months following the crash. Canadian adjusters and even defense lawyers in Canada just are used to seeing that outside of a real serious trauma level hospital immediate care scenario. And so that's probably the advantage for the Americans, is that they can tell that story much quicker.
Okay, so here's my last question. And before I ask this last question, we did a podcast on the importance of having a power of attorney in the state where you have your residence. And I can't stress enough that this book should almost be in your glove box in the United States. And hopefully it doesn't hurt against you, doesn't work against you, that you're aware of everything and you know your rights. Because accidents are accidents and people should be fairly compensated for it. But I'm going to tell you, I'm going to bring this book to Maui. It's going in the Jeep. It's going in the glove box. And I'm sure this is going to be a great guide for anybody who asks. Okay, here's my last question. As a Canadian, should I hire a personal injury lawyer on both sides of the border?
So that depends. There's not a definitely, definitely you want someone who understands both sides of the border, whether that's the same attorney or different attorney. There's different ways of getting to that, but absolutely, There are circumstances where you may need a lawyer locally in the jurisdiction where it occurred, sometimes, but also a lawyer in Canada that understands what remedies may be available to you in addition to those in the United States, and you really want to coordinate. My invitation, which I extend to everyone, is if you have questions, if you're not sure, just reach out and ask. Like, I get calls every week from lawyers all over the U.S., primarily from lawyers in the U.S., frankly, some in Canada as well, but mostly in the U.S., just asking questions. Hey, in this circumstance, am I missing anything? Are there any benefits available in their home jurisdiction that I need to be aware of? Sometimes you don't have an underinsured motorist claim, right? So you don't necessarily, but it's important to ask. So those lawyers might say, look, in Canada, there's 500,000 in coverage in the U.S. Here are the injuries, right? Because we can talk to each other, we can assess damages or the value of a claim in terms of what the ultimate recovery is. And sometimes American lawyers will reach out and say, in these circumstances, is there a viable excess claim in Canada or not? And sometimes the answer will be no. Like, if you get 500,000 for that case in the U.S., your client's not going to be entitled to a penny more in Canada because although part of the claim is governed by U.S. law, okay, so they really intertwine. Some parts of the claim, some parts of the damages claim, especially the pain and suffering portion, remains governed by Canadian law. So unless it's a case with the right amount of economic losses, there are sometimes circumstances where there is not an excess claim to Canada. Depends on the jurisdiction as to whether or not there are no fault benefits. So I know it's not a direct answer like yes in every occasion, but in every occasion, I would say ask the questions, get informed. It costs you nothing. We love talking to lawyers. Even if you have an American lawyer already, bring it up with them. Give them our name. They're welcome to call us. It won't cost anything. We don't charge for this. We're happy to share the information. And if you don't have a lawyer yet and you're wondering whether you need one in the state where it happened or in Canada or both, just give us a call, and I can usually figure that out in a pretty short, usually in an initial consultation. And if we can help, we're happy to help. And if not, we can at least steer you in the right direction, maybe make some introductions and give you some guidance to help you.
Andrew, this is what I've learned in this journey that I've been on to try and learn as much as I can and share that wealth of knowledge and the right people to connect our listeners to. You need to have a great cross-border accountant. We know you need a great cross-border or immigration person to be working and being available to you. And I would say as important, making sure that if you spend a lot of time in the States, you need to have someone else, like you got to have someone like Andrew on your side as well too, that can, all the risk that you're exposing yourself to if you get into an accident. So I got to tell you, I've enjoyed our conversations. We still haven't met in person. Maybe if the Toronto Maple Leafs go to the Stanley Cup Finals, I was invited yesterday to a Cup final game, so I look forward to it. But I truly appreciate your time, and I know our marketing teams will do a great job of getting this out so people can actually meet and be able to reach Andrew. So Andrew, thanks again for your time. Very much appreciated.
Gerry, it's always a pleasure. I absolute pleasure talking to you, and I really appreciate being here. Thank you again.
And I know I said I'd be going to Toronto, but it was Andrew said at the beginning of the call, he said, if we're going to meet anywhere, we're going to meet in Maui. So that makes a lot more sense. But thanks again for your knowledge and truly appreciate your time. Thank you again for listening to the Snowbird Expat Radio Podcast. The best way you can support the podcast is to forward the episode to a friend, and please don't hesitate to like, subscribe, or leave a comment. Now, before you go, Let me leave you with one of my favorite quotes. Be kind to all, the world is small.